Good morning, everybody. We're going to wait a couple more minutes here as people join on, but just please be patient and we'll get started here shortly.
For those who might have the side panel blocking the presentation, if you just go in it says view options and click off of the full screen mode, you'll get a little bit better viewing.
Chris, we're still waiting for maybe about 10 more people to join. Maybe a couple more minutes and then we can get started here.
I think we could probably get going, and if anybody jumps in late, it shouldn't be a problem, especially through the first intro slides.
That sounds good. Chris, would you like to kick it off for us?
Sure. Thanks, Adam. Good morning, everybody, and thanks very much for taking the time to go through this with us. It's a really exciting proposal here that we're about to unveil to you all. So thank you for taking 2 hours out of the day to join us. Here's just a short little agenda, giving you an idea of what's coming up. We're going to give you a recap from the first meeting in case you weren't able to make it, and then some of the progress in between since our first stakeholder meeting. And then we'll talk about the recommended draft network and also our system redesign. And then we'll talk a little bit about our public engagement steps and what will come after that. So some of you may have heard about the Better DTA movement, and it's really a brand about our comeback and everything we're doing right now. We've got a lot of exciting initiatives that are currently going on right now, and here's just 3 of them that are part of this Better DTA movement. We have Better Technology, which encompasses things like our My DTA mobile app. We just released that a few weeks ago, where we now have a mobile payment option and a mobile app to do trip planning and all kinds of fun things. So make sure to download that. There's Better Bus Stops, where we have a lot of money planned to go towards bus stop improvements. And then there's the better bus blueprint, which is what we're here for today. So why are we conducting this study? And it really developed out of our 2017 transit development plan, which many of you were a part of. And what we heard there from the community and from our board and everyone else was that we really wanted more frequent bus service and a less complicated system. We needed to improve efficiency, and that the DTA's current bus network is really complex and inflexible. So the Better Bus Blueprint is a cost-neutral plan. And this isn't being done due to any recent losses in passenger revenue or any pandemic-related situation. But we are looking through the lens of how do we become more attractive post-pandemic and put the best possible service to meet the needs of today and tomorrow. So the Stakeholder Committee, it's a group of broad representation from community organizations, elected officials. We've got transportation partners. There's folks who work in education and economic development and all kinds of groups. So there's a lot of unique perspectives, and a lot of you in this group here have many different hats. So we want your feedback, and we want you hopefully you'll become champions of this plan and work with your networks to promote our initiative and get the word out there so that we get as much feedback from the community as possible. Because right now it's really important that we hear from the community that this concept meets the needs or not, and what we might need to do to get there. So our goal is to be as inclusive as possible while balanced and have a manageable format for this meeting in particular.
Great. Well, Chris, I can take over from here if you want.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. And
yeah.
I'll first mention that we hired a Kinetics Transportation Group to help us with this project, and we're able to do that through a couple of different grants. The Wisconsin Department of Transportation gave us a grant, a planning grant, and then we had some federal funding which helped us. So through that, we were able to hire a very solid professional firm that's done a lot of great planning all around the country to help us out. So we're excited to introduce CTG and Adam. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chris. And I guess as a quick reminder, so we'll be giving a fairly extensive presentation here today. So if everyone can hold their questions till the end, we'll have some time for a Q&A here at the end of the presentation to kind of talk about some of the things we went over and any questions that you may have. So I just want to remind everybody of that. And also we are recording this presentation. And so just please be aware of that. And we will be posting this to the DTA website so you guys can be distributed and also share it with other people in your networks at a later date. That would be great. And so just to start, Chris gave a great introduction to our firm where our company is called Kinetics Transportation Group, and we work on transit, work with transit agencies and on transit studies all across the country. And really, we really pride ourselves on taking a very data-driven and community-inspired approach to any product that we work on, where we're really letting data and our analysis, give us the best recommendations for a lot of transit studies that we work on. Chris was mentioning that, we work all over the country, and we do. We work in the north, the south, the east, the west. We work in small towns, in large cities. We work in a variety of different climates. So we're very familiar with working in wintry climates. We're very familiar with working in small areas, as well as, very big cities and working on major projects. Some things I want to highlight that we have worked on more recently is that we do have experience with the Met Council and working with the Twin Cities. So we are kind of familiar with the Minnesota landscape, even though it's not quite Duluth, but we have experience working on some of the bus rapid transit projects down there for you guys, as well as some other studies in that region. So we are familiar with kind of the conditions, and Duluth is a very unique situation where, there are some, concerns about weather and access and how people can get to, certain stops and transit routes during the winter months, as well as just kind of provide the best service for that region. So without further ado, we'll get started kind of into everything here. The first thing, and for those of you who were at our first stakeholder meeting, Some of this will be a little bit repetitive in the beginning. We're going to go over some of the kind of the studies and different analysis that we've conducted in the past, as well as kind of catch you up to date on our progress, and then really get into what we're very excited about is the recommended draft network. So it's a new proposal for a new transit system in the Duluth area. So why do people take transit? And this is kind of, we want to kind of start with a little qualifiers about, what transit is, why people take it, as well as some definitions to kind of lay that groundwork for the context of everything we're going to be talking about today. But why people take transit, it's really just a means to get somewhere. So people really, they want to spend less time traveling and really want to get to their destinations faster. And a good reminder that we always think of is that transit is a public good. So we really need to balance the needs of many people. It's not always about serving a particular type of person. It's about serving as many people as we possibly can and getting people that access and that mobility to a lot of areas that they need to do to kind of get their day-to-day going. So just to start, I want to talk about some transit definitions that you guys are going to hear throughout the study. This is primarily looking at a few things, and some of you might be familiar with this, but some of these are kind of more transit terms that we like to use. The first one is frequency. And really just means just how often does a bus come? So if you walk out to a bus stop, if it comes every 10 minutes, it has 10-minute frequency. If it comes every 30-minute frequency. So this is just really a term that we like to use about how often it comes. We'll also mention the term span, and this is about how long that bus route operates throughout the day. So how many hours of the day does it operate? Does it start at 6 a.m. and it goes to midnight? How many days or how many hours are we looking at? And then many of you might be familiar with the term coverage, but it's really good to kind of dive deeper into what that actually means. And so when we say, people are covered by transit, what this actually means is we're looking at typically people and jobs and sometimes those types of metrics, but for those that can access, transit or access a bus. And really when we say coverage, it typically means that you're within like walking distance of a bus route. Sometimes it can be a little bit further. But one thing to kind of denote is that people can be covered in a variety of different ways. You can still be covered by a transit service if it comes only once a day, but you're also covered by that same service if it comes, 10, 30 times a day. And so kind of understanding that concept that just because you live near a bus route does not always mean that you have really good quality service, but you might still be covered by transit. And so we'll talk about that concept a little bit more as we go through this presentation. So we kind of highlighted this in the last presentation, but when we were going through the study and kind of coming up with some of these concepts, what we need to understand is, what goes into route planning? What are we always thinking about? And so some of that is related to some of the concepts we just went over. How often does the bus come? So frequency. And what days does the bus operate, as well as time? So that's span. Where does it go? How far do you have to walk to access some of these things? And then is it reliable? And can it get you to the places that you want to go? And so we're always thinking about these things when we're kind of putting together routes and kind of identifying, where people want to go and what's the best way to actually move people in the region. And when we build different systems, when we talk about transit, there's always trade-offs and different potential outcomes that we look at. So kind of the graphic here on the left is focusing on trade-offs. And so whenever you're looking at a system, there's always kind of this give and take that we need to be aware of. And so we're always looking at, how many people does a certain route serve? How can we serve those people versus how quickly can we get there? So we're always balancing, trying to pick up as many people versus giving people direct access to maybe key destinations or key areas in your system as fastly as possible. But then also we have to keep in mind that there's costs related with these things. So if a bus comes very often where you guys want really high frequencies, or you want, a bus to come every 10 minutes, that can be expensive versus if it comes every 60 minutes, that's a little bit less expensive. So we're always kind of looking at these trade-offs and trying to balance them the best way that makes sense for your system and each route individually. And then the potential outcomes kind of range. When we talk about coverage, we were talking about, potentially having routes that might not operate just on main roads, but they might go into neighborhoods. They might do what we call circulation, where they're going to be moving around and trying to pick up individuals closer to where they live, and then ultimately bring them to, maybe a location that they're trying to travel to. And so if you look at like the blue route in here, this is a type of route that would serve a lot of people, but it might be kind of slow because we're navigating through different neighborhoods. You're not really just on a straight path. So you're traveling slow, you might be picking up more people. You're also just having a longer route in general. And then we might look at something a little bit more balanced, which is the orange route here in the middle, where we're looking at something that might do a little bit of that circulation. So you might go into a couple neighborhoods, but primarily you're going to stay on these main corridor routes. And this can be a little bit faster, but it's a nice balance between being fast and picking up a lot of people. And then there's the green option, which is a very direct route where we're going to be looking at, you might not be doing as much circulation, and some people might have to maybe walk, a couple more blocks to actually get to that service, but it can be very fast and it can be direct. It can get people very quickly to where they want to go. And so we're always kind of considering these things in terms of different potential route outcomes when we're planning as well. And so we're going to come back to this, but you guys might have noticed this from our last presentation. And when we spoke to you last time, we were kind of in between phase 1 and phase 2. And this is a 5-phase study that we're looking to conduct here. And so when we talked to these last, we were looking at setting guiding principles and really understanding those existing conditions. And we had a very extensive report about the existing conditions, as well as a lot of the work that we put into that. That's been online on the DTA website for some time, as well as our presentation to you a few months ago was about that as well. And so we're going to go over some of those things today, and then we're going to move on into phase 3 and phase 4, and that's going to be the second half of our conversation today. We will have a brief break in between. And so I just kind of want to acknowledge that, but generally, we'll be covering this first section relatively quickly. And I would like, if you guys have questions or, want to dive into any more details, we do have a lot of materials available for you on the DTA website that you can be directed to as well. So with phase 1, we really jumped into guiding principles, and we worked with yourself, with a stakeholder group, as well as a group of what we call our regional experts, our technical advisory committee, or the TAG. We worked with this group to really put together, some guiding principles for this study. And we came up with these 8 items. We want the new system to be equitable. We want it to be attractive to the greatest number of Twin Ports residents as possible. We want to expand access to opportunity, improve the passenger experience. We want a resilient and more scalable system that can be adaptable. We want to be, deploying our resources efficiently, making sure we're putting, the money on certain routes that make the most sense to attract the most riders, making sure that we're serving everybody as efficiently as possible. And then we want this kind of to be a community-inspired solution. We want your feedback. We want to know, what people like and don't like about these items. And so as we get into it, we're going to kind of dive into the existing conditions assessment. And there's really, 5 components of this. And I'm just going to highlight them really quickly, and then we'll show you some reminders of some of the data and analysis that we've done, as well as give a recap of some of the key, findings from our assessment. So as we go through, we typically look at what we call a demographic and market analysis. So we're looking at, where people live, where people work. We're looking at the different components of people, whether that's, low income. We're looking at, vehicle ownership. We're looking at age. We're looking at all these different breakdowns of people and trying to understand the region the best we can. We get into something called transit propensity and latent demand, and I'll explain that a little bit more, but we're essentially looking at where are the most people likely to ride in the system, as well as where there are areas that we can grow ridership. And we looked at some regional travel patterns as well. So how are people getting around the system? Where are they really looking at in terms of travel, not necessarily taking transit, but just typical patterns we're seeing in the region. Are a lot of people going to downtown? Are you going to, west to Loop, UMB, Miller Hill Mall? Where is this occurring and where are people traveling from? We looked at a very detailed assessment of the existing system. So we looked at, the DTA system as is today. We'll really before the pandemic, as well as kind of the current conditions as we're going now. But looking at, the different services that were offered at the different frequencies. So how often were services running? How many routes do you guys have? And then kind of we take all that information and really look at performance. So not only are we looking at something what we call on-time performance, which is, are buses showing up on time? Are they matching a schedule so people can rely on that? But we're also looking at productivity. So how do these routes produce? How many riders do they have? How many resources the DTA is spending on them? What is the comparison between some of those things? And so we look at a lot of different evaluation metrics to really figure out, what are the most productive routes in the system, understand why they're productive, as well as what are the least productive routes, and understanding why those aren't working that well in some of these areas, and are there better ways to improve those things. And then we really take a deep dive into ridership, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. And so the other kind of items that we'll kind of walk through 3 and 4 here. So identifying of activity centers and travel time and access analysis. We also cover that with you in the first meeting. And primarily, we really focus and understood that there's a lot of population and employment happening, or people wanting to get to certain activity centers in your region. And we know that there's a lot of ridership happening in those areas. So we've identified some of those things, but we've also analyzed regional travel times and have looked at, how people move throughout the system, and understanding that the DTA current system does kind of change throughout the day. There are some things that we see where there's a lot of service in the peak. So during the AM rush or PM rush period in the past, there's been a lot more service, and sometimes that changes throughout the day. And so we've assessed that and looked at that. We also looked at access. how accessible are some of these areas? Are a lot of the areas that people want to go accessible? Is that consistent? Is that reliable? Is there quality transit service being provided to those areas? And then area 5 here, this is a little bit new, this section. So we didn't talk about this totally in the stakeholder 1 meeting, but this is looking at our survey results. So we actually had a community survey. It was a rider and non-rider public survey that many of you helped distribute. And so we really appreciate your help on that and going into everything there. But we have some results from that we can share with you today. We've talked with the DTA drivers. We've interviewed them and also surveyed them to understand some of the operational things going on. Are the drivers having any issues, driving throughout the year? Are there some routes that might need to be improved? What are customers saying about some of the services? And the drivers can really give us a lot of valuable insight for those types of things. As well as we did some polling with you guys during the first meeting and really understood, some of what your preferences were. And so we'll kind of highlight those and those results and kind of bring that all together here at the end. So we're going to go through this a little bit quickly, but really what I want to focus on is kind of the high level elements. So I kind of talked briefly about all these things, but when we start any study, we're looking at a study area. We're trying to define, where is the existing system? Are there any areas outside of this existing system that we might want to serve? And so we kind of did an expansion. We're looking at, an area outside of where kind of the existing DTA routes already serve and the kind of the greater Twin Ports region here, and try to identify if there's any other areas that maybe we want to expand service to outward at least. And when we looked at that, there wasn't really major expansion areas, and primarily because the DTA operates in a lot of the more dense areas in the system where a lot of people live, where a lot of jobs are. And so we actually did a calculation in about 75% of the whole study area. So it's actually this whole area that's outlined in dashed lines here is within a quarter mile of any of the routes. So a lot of people are concentrated where the DTA currently operates, as well as employment is very high, about 86% is really concentrated in a lot of areas where the DTA operates currently today. And in terms of any population groups and employment opportunities that are outside of kind of this area, there wasn't a lot of those major groups. So there wasn't a major employer that has thousands and thousands of people that's a couple miles outside of the system. There weren't, population or any residential communities where there was, a large amount of people that would seem that we can be able to easily serve with the existing resources. And so we really started concentrating on, the profile of where you guys currently operate and some of the adjacent areas that we can focus on for, new developments that might be occurring as well. And so when we mention this demographic assessment, we look at things like I was mentioning, population and employment are the big key factors. And we look at a variety of different things related to population, all the characteristics of these people. But I want to highlight just kind of, we take a look at these things, we look at density. So we look at, where a lot of people living. Are they living, downtown? Are we living there in UMD? Are we seeing some stuff in West Duluth? You're seeing a lot of concentration in Superior where people actually are living. And then we also compare that to jobs, where the majority of jobs happening. How many jobs are in downtown? How many jobs are around the region? Is transit providing enough access to those areas? So we continue looking at those things throughout the study. And then we do these things, and I mentioned this briefly before, but we look at transit propensity and latent demand. And so to describe, we'll start on the left here and describe what transit propensity is. It's really, a metric that we use where we look at a lot of demographic information. We take things like population density, we look at income levels, we look at things like vehicle ownership, and we kind of put together and make a metric that will help us basically understand where we think people are most likely to ride or to take transit. And so to kind of highlight this, the areas that are kind of in the light blue and the dark blue are areas that really, we think that the demographic makeup really makes sense to the point where these areas are really areas that could produce a higher level of riders. And so it helps us really focus on, areas that we think might be places that are good for ridership, as well as where we definitely need to serve to make sure that we're providing service to these people. And then we can do an analysis called a latent demand analysis. So we actually take the transit propensity and we cross-reference it with your existing ridership information. And so when we do this, we can make this index. And really what it is a little bit complicated, but what we can end up seeing is these areas that are kind of in red those are areas that we're figuring out that have high transit propensity, but not a lot of ridership today, which means that we can potentially grow ridership in those areas. So we're looking at not only where we think people will likely take ridership or to take transit, but also where we think that the service could actually improve and add additional riders to the system. We also looked at some regional travel information, and this is something that we call location-based service data. So it's a fancy term for cell phone data. And we showed this to you guys in the past, and we looked at, in the beginning of the study, looked at two different things. We looked at 2019 and 2020 travel patterns just throughout the region, and we did a little high-level assessment. And so unfortunately, we don't have data for 2021 and beyond, and things as the pandemic is changing, as things are moving forward, some of these travel patterns tend to change. But we did really notice that, especially in 2019, this major focus to a lot of these key areas, to downtown, to UMD, Miller Hill Mall, to Superior, as well as West Duluth. We're really seeing those patterns really stick. And then during the pandemic, we saw some shifts in those patterns and what happened in terms of a lot more people were still making trips up to the Miller Hill Mall and to some certain commercial and shopping areas. There's still trips to UMD as well as to downtown, a little bit less magnitude. Those were dropping. And really what we're seeing across the nation today is we're seeing transit ridership slowly start to increase, people slowly starting to change their travel patterns a little bit and kind of coming out and maybe going back to normal in some cases, but then in other cases we're seeing things shift entirely. And so what will happen in 2021 and beyond is still not entirely clear, but we do know that we're going to have to be reacting to maybe people having different jobs. They might not be working 9-to-5 jobs. They might have a different job altogether, or maybe they have shifted work schedules. People might also be working from home more often, and these types of things where we have to kind of plan around that and understand that maybe transit travel doesn't just happen during the peaks, and so during the AM rush or the PM rush, but maybe this is something that needs to be spread out across the day where people can really find a service that if you need to get to work by 10 or 11 and maybe come home closer to 6 or 7 or 8 o'clock at night, then maybe the transit service can be adapted a little bit more to kind of fill your needs there.
Something else we heard a lot of and learned a lot from the pandemic. We were able to track ridership trends, and through that, we really saw where our essential employees really were and where they were riding from and what parts of our service were the most important. And it changed all throughout the pandemic, but we got a really good feeling of who in the community and where in the community are the most transit dependent riders. So we've learned a lot in the last year.
Absolutely, and that's a great point, Chris. Just trying to identify where people have consistently been riding, as well as kind of adapt as we look forward into the future. So we'll talk about the existing service, and again, we'll kind of go through this pretty quickly. But as we're looking at some of these things, one thing I want to mention is just, and I don't know how familiar everyone is with all of the routes in the system, but this will be a good review of all of that, where we look at, and on the weekdays, there's about 33 routes that are operating, and these operate at a variety of different times. And we'll show you some graphics here in the next couple of slides that will kind of talk about that a little bit more. But you have some services that run all day, you have some that only operate during certain times of the day, and it's a variety of different services, and it can be a little bit complex at times. And then on the weekends and Saturdays and Sundays, a lot of those kind of special services that we're seeing that operate at certain times tend to drop, and there's a lot less services actually out there operating. And so when we really notice is that the system is pretty efficient today in terms of an operational standpoint, but it can be very complex for people to understand, especially for new riders, where they may not be familiar with some of the different patterns that are happening and when they exactly can ride services. And I would say that technology has really helped bridge the gap on a lot of those types of things, but having a more simplistic system where people can really rely on where it goes is really, important in the future, and how that's going to kind of change the landscape of things here. And so the other thing that we really did notice as well is that there is some variation to the schedule. We know that with UMD, being a focus point on the kind of the east side of town here in Duluth, that sometimes, the schedule will change based on when they're in session, when they're not in session. There's some variation there. So we kind of will address that as well as we move forward. So I want to start with what we call a frequency chart. And so this is an interesting graphic that we like to show. And what it actually shows is a couple things. So it lists all the routes on the left. And so you'll notice that there's some big routes and some small routes. Anytime you see a small route, that really means that it's something that operates only at select times. So it's not something that is, usually as consistent, whether it might only operate on the weekend, it might only operate during like an AM peak, which is, maybe a 6 to 9 time frame or 7 to 9 time frame, or it will operate only at night. And so when we look at this is actually showing a couple things. So for each route by hour, it's showing what your typical frequency is, and we'll kind of highlight them up here where we have mainly what we're seeing a lot of 30-minute and 60-minute frequencies. And so you'll kind of go across this and you'll see the blues and the purples everywhere. And so that tells you what the frequency is, but it also tells you how long it operates for. So the route 1 operates from roughly 5 a.m. and it goes all the way to about 10. And so we'll talk about kind of how that looks. But what we really notice when we look at these things is kind of compare weekday and Saturdays and Sundays. And we're trying to figure out, how does the system change throughout the day? And looking at it, we'll notice that a lot of routes start and end at different times. You'll see some things kind of cut off, or all of a sudden there's gaps in here. There's kind of this inconsistency to when that's happening. And so that can be confusing for riders from time to time, and make it a little bit harder to navigate the system. We also notice on the weekends how much more sparse this looks. So we have all of these different routes operating, all of these different patterns happening. And then on the weekend, you'll notice some things drop off. And I'll say that, when we look into the future, there's still a lot of people who need to take transit on the weekends. And when you look at this area of drop off and how it changes, not only are they getting less service, but it can be a little bit confusing, and it's hard to identify, who can rely on what route throughout the year and throughout their travels. And so this is really important to kind of look at. And one thing I'll mention is we do notice that a lot of these routes tend to overlap with each other. And when they overlap, they create what we call an effective frequency. And so that's a term of basically looking at corridors or looking at, roads and trying to figure out how many buses are coming per hour and identifying some of those things. And so when we go through that a little bit more, what we're actually highlighting here is a few things. So we're highlighting when throughout the day, and this is for weekdays, but when transit service is actually running and then how those overlap. And so because there's so many services that tend to overlap on a lot of the same corridors, we were trying to understand as professionals, as transit professionals, where you guys put a lot of the service, where that's operating and how that changes throughout the day, especially with those different patterns that are happening. So we look at the early, the AM peak, the midday, the PM peak, evening and night. And so these are kind of broken up by certain sets of hours. But generally, the way to understand this is that during the AM peak, we can really understand what's happening kind of in certain areas where we notice that I have some information down here, but the big red dots are 10-minute frequencies or better. So that's just a kind of average that we're looking at. We're looking at orange being 20 to 10, yellow being 30 to 20, and these light blues 30 to 60. And then anything over 60 or not in service was kind of dropped off as well. But what you look at is we're really looking for those reds and those oranges where we're seeing the most services in here. And then in the AM peak, we see a lot of service kind of happening in this main corridor. We are seeing some stuff happen up the hill to the Hill Mall. We are seeing some stuff happening down in the Superior area. But then what happens is we get into the midday. So this is a time frame that's typically after 9 a.m., usually before about 2 or 3 p.m., that the service changes quite drastically. We'll still have a lot of service in this main corridor, but we notice that there's a little bit less service that's happening out in these outer areas. Superior has a lot less service as well on average that's happening. And so we kind of notice that there's a shift between those periods. We look at the PM peak and we still kind of see, that main area and start service to start coming back in these areas, but still a shift. And then into the evening, so this is typically after about 6 p.m., we really see that reduction start to happen when a lot of service starts to thin out. We would still see a little bit of action happening here in the main kind of east-west main line or on the main corridors on Superior and Grand. But this starts to kind of thin out as well. And then in the nighttime, so typically after about 10 p.m., a lot of the services are effectively dropping off and then eventually going offline. So I mentioned we look at a lot of metrics and performance metrics in particular, and one of those is on-time performance. So are the buses, meeting their schedules? Are they coming on time? Can people rely on them? And the good news is that the DTA does a really good job at on-time performance. Typically, their routes average over 80%, if not much higher. And this is from a subset of information that we looked at here in late 2019. And so this is about a year and a half old as we look at this. But typically, when we're looking at this data, it's not really a major issue for a lot of the routes, but we were seeing a couple of small trends kind of reoccurring. And we heard this from the drivers as well, that the superior routes, the 16s and the 17s that were out there tend to operate late sometimes. And some of that has to do with some constrained resources as well as other limitations that are out there in the system. But we do know that, when you're coming across the bridge, you're going to Superior or into Duluth, there sometimes can be some delay. Getting people on and off those routes can be a challenge, as well as just the time allocated can also be a challenge. And really trying to figure out how to improve that is a goal of ours as well when we look at these studies. And we do notice that trend tends to happen as well for some of those select period or express trips that we kind of highlighted before. So those services that only operate during the AM or during the PM, those might be, other areas that we look at to maybe figuring out what's going on with those and try to identify how we can make that performance better and make sure that those routes are on time. We look at more metrics. So we look at, where ridership is in the system. We look at ridership by route. And so this will actually help us identify a few things. We identify, what are the workhorses of your system, where a lot of ridership is occurring. And so we'll look at some of the routes, and we can kind of notice that there's quite a few routes up here, about 10 routes that really produce at least 600 riders or more a day. And these are kind of what we'd say your workhorses. And then these tend to drop off where we have a lot less productive services where less people take. We also separate out those peak period services. Well, those don't operate quite as often, so they're going to have less riders. We look at productivity measures related to this. And so we take all this information, we put together what we call route profiles. So we look at very detailed information about each route, how often it runs. We review things like productivity, which is metrics that we come up with to try to determine, how efficient are they. So we look at things like how many riders are taking it and how much it's costing the DTA. So we kind of compare that. We look at how many riders per trip are out there. We compare those per route. We look at individual riderships. We look at stop level to identify where that ridership on each route is occurring. And we review all this information and bring it together to help inform us to really understand and paint that picture of what's going on today in the system, where people are riding, where they're not riding, and what might make sense in the future. So what we do with a lot of ridership data, I mentioned stop level ridership, and what we like to do is aggregate it to be able to really figure out where the major areas in the system where a lot of ridership is occurring. And we do this thing called a hotspot analysis. And what it really is we basically aggregate a lot of ridership into about quarter-mile squares. So we're looking at these little squares and trying to identify, where are these big groups of ridership happening in the system. And through this process, we're able to identify that kind of happens in 5 key areas. And you'll kind of see these highlighted here on the map here. But we looked at, downtown Duluth obviously is a big area where a lot of people are riding transit. Not only is the DTC down there, but there's a lot of major employers like Essentia Health that are located down there that a lot of people are going to and from every day. UMD is a big one as we go through there, as well as the Miller Hill Mall, West Duluth, and parts of Lincoln Park, as well as downtown Superior. And so we took all this analysis and we started focusing on those 5 key areas that we're calling activity centers. And what I want to kind of show you as we're looking at this is kind of how we assess this. And what we did is for each of these activity centers, so these are major areas we're seeing a lot of ridership, we wanted to take like a boundary and really see, how many people, how many jobs, how much actual ridership is occurring in each of these areas. And so, it was pretty fascinating for us when we looked at each of these areas and kind of this buffer around each one. We are able to determine that about 66% of your daily ridership actually happens in these areas. And then in those areas themselves, about 50% of the entire region's employment is in those areas as well. So this means that a lot of people are riding. There's a lot of focus on employment. There's also, recreational, commercial, and leisure activities in a lot of these areas where people might be going for not just work, but for other trips such as shopping, going to a lot of these locations. And so we find that very valuable to serve these. So not only are you having a lot of riders, but there's a lot of, activity going on where we need to focus on potentially providing more service to these areas. The other thing I'll mention is that population in the region, only 25% of people are actually located in these areas. There is a lot of population going on here, but a lot of people will need to get to these areas from outside. So we'll have to find routes that will actually get people into these areas as well as between them very quickly. So it's an important concept to keep in mind as we kind of keep moving forward. So we did some detailed analysis, and this is really helpful. When we look at any system, we want to really understand, I mentioned this before, but really understand how people are taking transit, how they're traveling, how long does that take? And so we can do some complicated and advanced analysis through some of our software programs that we use that really focuses on evaluating travel time. And so we look at things like walk time and wait time and in-vehicle travel time. So this basically is a complete trip. So if I'm leaving my house, I'm walking to a bus stop, I'm getting on a bus, I'm taking that maybe to DTC, and then I'm transferring into another route. We can kind of calculate some of that and try to figure out, what is the access to different parts of the system? Is there good connectivity between certain areas? Is there bad connectivity between areas? And so we're able to assess those individually, but also systematically, and really kind of honed in on some differences that we were seeing between the day and evening. And we'll talk about that here in an upcoming slide. The other thing we look at is access, and something that we've been really interested in, especially in this kind of post-pandemic world, or as the pandemic is kind of coming to a slower point right now, really focusing on what quality transit is and how can that actually provide better access to a lot of people. And so the way that we define quality transit is a service that's consistent and it's very reliable. And it actually is consistent and reliable throughout most of the day. And so we're really trying to assess, can a lot of areas be reached throughout the day or only at certain times? And really, how long does it take to reach those areas? If you can access it, does it take 60 minutes? Does it take less than 60 minutes? Can we get there in 30? And so we're trying to assess all these different things in terms of access, but really trying to focus on something that is, a consistent and reliable metric for us to evaluate things. And so just to give a little bit more detail into what I was describing there, I just want to kind of show on the left here, we look at travel time, and often we look at average travel time. So we like to measure travel time across the day. So a good example is to look at maybe travel time from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. That's probably when a majority of people in the system are taking the service. And we like to evaluate that on average to see how long that takes. And so one thing I would say is that, we can see, sometimes maybe during at 7 a.m., your trip might be really fast, but then at 10 a.m., it might take a lot longer. And so we're trying to not only capture those highs and lows that often happen to people, but seeing on average what their travel time is between areas. And we do things like focus on key locations. So in this example, we're looking at travel between maybe those key destinations or key activity centers like UMD and downtown and Miller Hill Mall, West Duluth and Superior. But then we look at areas in the region to those locations. So we're like, if we look at and take a bunch of points and spread them out throughout the system, how long does it take me to get from one area further out to downtown? And we can kind of assess all those locations as well. And then we can kind of do this all locations where we really can assess not only are you, how long does it take you to get to the major activity centers, but if you need to go to a variety of different places, what does that mean? How long is that going to take you? We can kind of assess that, and we have here. So I want to get back to quality transit area. And this is, again, it's a little bit of a complicated metric, and I think it offers some explanation here in terms of really what we're focusing on is how often our area is accessible. And really what we do is we end up coming up, and I'll show you some examples of this, we end up coming up with kind of a graphic like this, where it's an area that we're looking at from a specific location, and we're trying to see, how accessible is it, and how long it takes you to get there. So it really is 3 different components. It's accessibility, it's mobility, and consistency that we're trying to evaluate. So we're trying to see, is it really getting people where they want to go? Does this area cover where they want to go? Is it, mobility? Is it really getting riders to their destinations quickly? Does it take 60 minutes? Does it take 30 minutes? How far can somebody travel, and how about in about 60 minutes as well? We can kind of evaluate those things, as well as consistency. So is it reliable? Can you make this trip throughout the entire day or most parts of the day? Or is it only really concentrating on, one time period where it's really good if you can make that trip between 7 and 9 a.m., maybe during that AM rush period, but any other times it's going to take you much, much longer to get any other place. And so we evaluate that as we go forward. So I mentioned there was a difference between day service and evening service. And what I want to highlight here is we were looking at weekday service. So we're looking at travel patterns that are happening on the weekday. And we kind of evaluated these 2 time periods. And the reason between that is looking at some of how services kind of changed throughout these time periods. And so we want to take a deeper dive in evaluating this. And one thing I'll mention is that kind of looking at the day service here. So we evaluated time period between 7 a.m. and 6 p.m. Again, it's a majority of the day hours, and we want to see what's happening. And we also evaluate the evening with 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. a little bit later to see what also changes in the system at that time. And so I guess for both items here, we generally saw that a lot of people can access downtown Duluth from a variety of parts in the system, throughout the day, even in the day and the evening, it's fairly consistent. There are a little bit of differences here, but for the most part, there's always better access to downtown. And this tends to change for a lot of the other locations. So we also looked at kind of in the day service over here, there was some varied connections that we identified that also could be made. So we saw that a lot of things for downtown Superior to a lot of other locations, on average, it took over 60 minutes, a little bit longer trips for people to get to other parts, especially on the Minnesota side, trying to get to other areas. We do see that there is a connection between the Miller Hill Mall and kind of West Duluth area. There's a lot of services that are making those trips today. So it's fairly easy to get between those locations. And then we also saw that UMD could serve downtown, but was really limited to couldn't get to a lot of other locations. So if you were at UMD or living or in the downtown area, you should be able to get in between pretty efficiently. But then if you're trying to go to others such as the Miller Hill Mall or maybe West Duluth or Superior, those areas might be a little bit more challenging to get to. And this changes a little bit again in the evening service where, again, there is some access to downtown with the exception of Superior. So Superior tends to drop off their service at about 6 to 7 o'clock. And so there's not as much access kind of across the bridge into the Minnesota side, as well as kind of return trips back. And so we do kind of acknowledge that connection. And then all those other connections we mentioned over here on the left, those tend to drop off as well. So there's really not a lot of access that's happening in this evening period to other locations. So you might be able to get downtown, but you might have quite a bit of a longer trip getting to a lot of the other locations or not being able to reach some of these areas at all. So to kind of show you really quick examples, I have 2 slides here I want to show you to just talk about our travel time analysis and that quality transit area to give you a little bit of picture about what specifically we were looking at and what we're talking about. So when we look at travel time, on this map here, you'll see a dot, and this is a location that we're trying to evaluate things from. And then we're looking at all these other blue dots in the region, and we kind of pick points through key areas throughout the system. We're trying to identify these different travel patterns, as I mentioned before. And so this graph over here is really showing to and from downtown Duluth, what are the average times to these locations? And the blue areas down here showing, trips that can be made within 30 minutes. Orange is trips that can be made between 30 and 60 minutes, and black is areas that are taking longer than 60 minutes to travel to on average throughout the day. And so we're able to kind of capture some metrics and identify areas that are easy to reach, areas that might be still okay to reach, but getting a little bit longer, and then those areas that take much longer to travel to. And then when we look at this quality transit area metric, so that's kind of what I was mentioning before, is we're actually looking at how far people can travel within 60 minutes. And what this is it's a consistent travel shed. So it's an area that we're looking at between 7 a.m. and 10 p.m. And we're trying to identify that we know that these areas that are highlighted in this teal color are areas that can be accessed fairly consistently to and from downtown Duluth within about 60 minutes. And so we know that people can get from UMD to downtown on average within 60 minutes. You can get up to the North Hill Mall, you can go down to West Duluth, but the areas that are kind of dropped off here are my areas that might take a lot longer to travel as well. Chris?
Hey, Adam, can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Okay, good. I messed around with my microphone, so hopefully it's working here. But just to be really clear, Adam, this is an aggregate of all the different mock schedule or the schedules and then an average of it. So it doesn't mean if you go from one dot that or that the average time is truly a 60-minute bus ride, but that if you walk outside your door, you walk to and wait at a bus stop at any given time, that's how long it might be. So if you're following a true bus schedule, it's not going to take you that long. So it's just
Correct.
a bigger average of the full aggregate to give us an estimate of travel times.
Yep. And it's to help us identify that access as a whole and see really where there's areas where we know that there's a lot more consistent service going on and able to access that throughout the day versus maybe areas that might be a little bit more challenging to get to. And so we did the same thing for every activity center, but we also I'm going to show an example of downtown Superior. So I'm going to highlight these and bounce back and forth really quick. Where this is downtown Duluth and this is downtown Superior. And so when we talk about that average and kind of measuring across the day between 7 a.m. and 10 p.m., you'll notice that this graph is quite different. So there's a lot less blues and oranges and a lot more black kind of bars here. And these are really denoting that there's a lot more trips that take a lot longer on average. And a lot of this has to do with service being cut off after about 6 to 7 o'clock. Is that we know that this area, if you live or want to get to and from Superior, you have to be fairly reliant on that schedule. You need to understand when those trips are coming. And if you miss a bus, things like that, you might have a long wait time before you can kind of get back and forth between the two. And so this is kind of highlighting that consistent area of access where we think that it's, sometimes it's a little bit more challenging to get to other areas in the system. And these are things that we're actively looking at and trying to improve. So this is a little bit of a new section, and this is kind of the end of the recap as we get into it, but it's the results that we saw from our survey, as well as kind of to reiterate what you guys were telling us in the polling. So as we get into this, our community survey was out there. Many of you, this actually kicked off right after our last stakeholder meeting. I'm sure a lot of you were familiar with it, and we appreciate everybody kind of passing it around and getting into your networks of people. We had the survey active for about 46 days, so a little over a month and a half, and we got over 560 responses from it. It was available both online and in paper format, so that was accounting for both of those items. And we really did have questions related to different options about DTA, their service, demographics, and how people were traveling. And so we're just going to go over a couple of the quick highlights of these, but we will have more available materials on these here shortly if somebody would like to dive in a little bit deeper to understand some more of the questions. And so typically when most of these surveys, we ask a couple of questions about demographics, and 2 that I really want to focus on were the annual income and access to vehicles. We said about a little over 50% of people make less than $50,000 annually. And that's kind of a big part of the system. And so we're kind of highlighting these areas in terms of, where we're getting, questions from. Are a lot of these people users? Are they not users? How much income do they make? Are they relying on transit? Are they not? As well as access to vehicles. So these things are kind of related often where we're looking at it's almost a 50-50 split here, but we got answers from people who were not only, have vehicle access almost all the time, but also those who maybe don't have access or only sometimes have access to vehicles, and we got their preferences as well. And so this is just some high level kind of step back of demographic information that we saw. But then we asked them a variety of questions. And one of those, it was just very similar to something that we've asked you all here in the past is, as an organization, what should the DTA really focus on? And these are ranked in order about what we heard from them. And so as the community responded to this, a lot of things we heard is that they were really focused on increasing ridership. They wanted to be able to have a lot more ridership in the system. They want better access to employment. They were highlighting things about getting additional funding for some more services or to improve kind of performance measures. So maybe enhancing some of those existing services and really focusing on serving areas of high ridership potential was the other big option that they were really focusing on. We also asked them some elements of the survey about the pandemic and how that might impact their travel behavior. And so this was done during the pandemic. And one thing I want to highlight here is on the right, this is a chart that we like to call it's called a Sankey chart. And it's more of a complicated term, but really what it's looking at is on the left, we asked people to respond to what they were doing before the pandemic. So actually how they were using DTA services before the pandemic. Were they always using the system or almost daily? Were they only using it a few times a week, few times a month? Was it just occasional, or they basically rarely did it or never? And then what we do is we ask them, after the pandemic kind of is behind us, how will they take transit in the future? And so this is subjective in some way where it was still during the pandemic, but we really want to hear people's preferences in terms of, are they actively using transit and they still plan on using transit, or has their mind changed a little bit and they don't want to come back necessarily? And so what you can do is you can follow these lines across and you can see how people's minds have changed or what their preferences are between these. And just to give you some highlights, when we look at things around the country, we have noticed that there is this gradual kind of comeback of ridership. So ridership is slowly coming back in a lot of places. We think that just looking at nationally, this is going to be a very gradual trend. We think that's going to happen likely here in Duluth. There's a lot more people, as the pandemic eases, will be more comfortable taking transit again. There's still a lot of people who are reliant on transit on a daily basis and never stop taking transit. But there's also a lot of people who are able to work from home, or maybe got different jobs and have changed up their travel patterns. They might be looking at changing how they actually use transit in the future. And we'll see that we don't really know what the long-term impacts are of the pandemic today, but we do know that Duluth has a really strong ridership base. And so what I mean by that is when we asked these questions, there was about 89% of them in this top category who almost ride daily stated that they would continue almost riding daily. And so the other 11%, most of them are saying that they will still ride a few times a week. And so we're really seeing the strong base of ridership of people who are riding daily already. Most of them are continuing to ride daily. And that's going to probably be the trend moving forward. We also noted that, when we look at all of these, 70% of respondents didn't change their answer whatsoever, indicating that there wasn't a huge, change in terms of how people might be changing their travel patterns if there weren't other aspects that are out there. And so we do feel fairly confident that a lot of ridership will gradually return. Things might be changing, might be a little bit different in the future. And again, when people's travel patterns change, we need to adapt to those types of things. But we do think it's consistent with the national trend of kind of slowly building back some ridership. And hopefully, what we're proposing with our new network will actually really help build ridership even more in the future. So I also mentioned we conducted a driver survey, and we also interviewed the different drivers of the DTA to really understand, again, some of the operational things that they go through. Are certain routes difficult to drive? Are there any things we need to be aware of, especially with weather-related things, with the steep inclines and topography issues that do kind of go out there? Are people having access issues? Are drivers having issues, navigating some of these turns? What would make the most sense in the future? And so we asked them all these questions to make sure that we're aware of those things, and we're actually looking at, redoing the system or kind of making changes to the system that are understanding that. And so one thing I would highlight here is that when we asked drivers what are the most difficult routes for them to drive, they overwhelmingly responded the 17 and the 16. So these are superior based routes. And when you look at them, a lot of that have to do with not having enough travel time. So the schedule being a little bit tight for them to actually maintain. So they were saying that a lot of times these are difficult where they can't maintain the schedule. They would look for more time in there. We also were seeing the same thing happening with the 10H, which is a route that would primarily, it operates on the weekdays, but it has additional service on the weekends that goes up to the Miller Hill Mall. There was a lot of people riding that, with making it a little bit more difficult to navigate and a little bit slower. And so we kind of heard all of these things from the drivers and started to really build them into our analysis and our assessment of everything that was going on. And so I'm sure all of you will be familiar with this, and this is the last section of our kind of review here, but looking at when we talked a couple months ago, we asked you what should the DTA focus on? And you guys ranked these in order. We polled you guys and you gave us these responses. And so really what the DTA should focus on, you said that they should focus on serving areas of higher ridership and really higher ridership potential. So where can ridership grow and where are the most important areas to serve for riders? Increasing access to employment, increasing ridership again, operating efficiently, and looking at equity and social justice issues. And so these were kind of the big hitters that a lot of you said that you would like to focus on. And then we look back and we asked you, what is your appetite for change? Meaning, how much would you be willing to change the system in the future to maybe make a better system to meet, updating travel patterns and different emerging trends in the region? And overwhelmingly, over about 75% of you said you either moderately or significantly be open to changing the network. And so we took that feedback and we looked at making some changes to the network and moving forward, understanding that a lot of you feel fairly comfortable with having some changes going on as well. So as a quick recap, I want to highlight what we saw and really what we heard. And really what we saw is, related to more of our assessment, our, analysis of the existing conditions. And really what we saw is we looked at the DTA really does cover a lot of the population employment areas in the region. This is with a variety of different service types, but they do have routes that typically cover the major areas here. And there weren't a lot of areas for expansion outward. So we're really starting to focus in on a lot of those corridors that are, condensed in these areas where service already operates. We highlighted there was 5 key destination areas or activity centers, and a lot of ridership and employment was concentrated in there. So these are really critical for the system in terms of identifying that a lot of people want to get here, a lot of people are riding there currently. We need to focus on those to some extent and providing quality service to those areas. And we did highlight the inconsistencies and some of the complexities of that system. So looking at, different services starting at different times and ending at others, understanding, frequencies kind of changing, different service types that might be out there. The day and evening service tend to change a little bit. We noticed the major weekend reductions. So a lot of service dropping off on Saturday and Sundays. And then there were a lot of longer travel times on average to a lot of locations that weren't focused on downtown Duluth. And then what did we hear from everybody? And so through our surveys, through our polling, and through our interviews, we really heard that we should focus on increasing ridership and improving access to employment areas. And I think this is very important to really highlight these areas, making sure that we're providing the best service to these places that people want to get to. We do think that throughout the pandemic, that again, there's this trend of ridership continuing to tick back up, and we hope that hopefully it will gradually continue up and we can return to normal levels at some point, but hopefully with the new network as well, we can kind of see and adjust to those updated travel patterns of people and continue to grow that ridership. And then we also noted that almost 75% of the stakeholders did mention that they were open to kind of more of a significant change to the system. So what should we focus on and what are really the expected outcomes of the study? And so I just want to highlight this, that, we're here to see what the new network looks like. And we really want to make sure that the new network is attractive and more reliable and really serving as many people as possible. It can be adaptable and scalable. So adjustments can be made to that system that can, again, as travel patterns continue changing, that the DTA can easily make some changes to that system to better improve access and better improve transit for a lot of people in the region. And so we're looking at kind of those improved travel times and access to a lot of these major destinations and employment areas, and really be more consistent for all days of the week. So maybe not just on weekdays, but also on the weekends, trying to have a more consistent route structure so that people can easily understand it, and even especially those who are not necessarily familiar or daily users of the system, where they might be feeling more comfortable with understanding that system and able to use it. And I do want to highlight that on the DTA website, if you guys have more questions, a lot of these things, we can answer some of them later on during our Q&A session. But primarily, we have a very detailed analysis and reports that are up there on the website on the existing conditions that will kind of take a deeper dive into all these things that we just covered, as well as our previous stakeholder meeting does kind of we have a recording of that you guys can all listen to and watch again. That will give you some more context on these issues as well. So we're almost to break time here. I have a couple more slides and we'll take about a 5-minute break. But what I want to do is kind of introduce this new part of the phase. And this is something that you have not seen yet. And this is really the beginning of where we came up with this system that we're going to be showing you shortly. And this is called the Better Bus Blueprint. And so without further ado, I'll kind of jump into it. And so I mentioned before that we were in phase 1 and phase 2. And now we've shifted into phase 3 and phase 4, where we're looking at developing a recommended network or a draft network to actually get out in front of everybody for review, and then ultimately working to finalize that to make sure we have the best network out there possible for the community to use in the future. And so this all started in terms of how we kind of go about determining, what to test, what to look at, how do we develop a new system. The first step was we went through a process with route workshops. And so I mentioned before, we had this group of more regional experts that we call our TAG. It's a technical advisory group. And so it's a variety of people that we brought in, and we held these 3 workshops throughout the spring where we went through a lot of stuff that we just talked about. So we went through our existing conditions, went through all our materials, our analysis, the survey information. So what we're seeing, what we're hearing, what we're actually trying to focus on in those. And we brought that to them, as well as discussed different concepts about designing services, what are priorities of designing service, and came together and developed 2 scenarios. And this was really a collaborative effort between the consultants and us, as well as the DTA staff and these regional experts, in terms of trying to figure out and test a variety of different concepts, trying to focus on how we can better serve the region. All of this, as Chris mentioned before, is what we call cost neutral. So we're not really taking any service out of the system. We're not reducing service, but we're working within the existing means. So, as much service as provided today in terms of cost, we are still working within those same boundaries. And then ultimately, in the end, this collaborative effort, we were able to evaluate 2 different concepts, and we merged them together to come up with this network that we'll be showing you shortly. So during the route workshops, it's an exercise about trying to balance things and form a system. And one thing I want to kind of show you guys here is this graphic where we're looking at what we call service layers forming a network. So how do you form a transit network? How do you look at that? It's not just about one route. It's about how those routes interact with each other and how it connects people throughout the region. And so we'll look at a variety of different service types. And we'll talk about this a little bit more on the next slide, but we look at a variety of different service types and where our resources go into. And so one example here is scenario A, and these are all conceptual, so these have nothing to do with what we did for you guys necessarily here, but I just want to kind of explain this concept for you a little bit. What we're looking at, and here is this dark green line where it's actually a high frequent service where we're putting a lot of resources into that. And what that means is we designed a system like that, then there's a lot less resources to go around for the other services. And so we kind of highlight what that might look like. And then we look at it maybe a different scenario where we try to scale back some of that. So you see there's a lot less of this dark green in this one, but a lot more lines going on everywhere else. We're able to actually add a lot more service, cover a lot more people, and kind of look at those trade-offs between the 2. And so this is a general concept of typically what we go through in a route workshop setting, is looking at these things, looking at how individual routes perform, but as well as how they work as a system. And so when we do this, we mentioned these service types, and these are really important. And we did look at all of these types of services for our concepts as we went through these route workshops. One thing I want to mention is in the green, it's called a high frequency or pre-BRT service. For those not familiar with BRT, it's called bus rapid transit. We'll go into a more definition of that a little bit later. But generally, bus rapid transit is a very high, very high level, reliable bus service that's very similar to rail. You can move very quickly throughout regions. You have improved stops, really enhanced service, very fast travel times. That's something that's very important to look at. And so we looked at a high frequency service that kind of operates throughout the day through maybe major activity centers, so like in your core area that we're looking at. We looked at a few different frequent local services. So this is a service that might not be as advanced as maybe a BRT system or service like that, but it will be looking at a fairly high frequency and kind of connecting a lot of major areas. Local service, which is a step down, which is a lot of the typical service today where you're looking at maybe 30 and 60-minute frequencies. We looked at something called crosstown. So crosstown is a service that might be connecting areas, especially necessarily on the fringe. You might be connecting areas not always through downtown Duluth, but it's like, let's say an area like downtown Superior to West Duluth directly. And so we test out a couple of these things in here, looking at connecting people across the region through a few other route types. We looked at circulators. So circulators are kind of a way to look at connecting people into major areas. So these tend to be shorter routes. They tend to circulate or move through neighborhoods, kind of winding and collecting people and bringing them to a destination. These are often very common in lower density areas where not as many people or maybe jobs and employment opportunities and things like that are available, but are also very important. We looked at the concept of flex zones, and these are have a variety of different names. So a flex zone, you might have heard of microtransit, you might have heard of mobility on demand services, or even the flex zone name. And really what this is a zone that we'd have where people can actually, maybe use a mobile app or call into a call center and get picked up typically in a special vehicle or a smaller bus that will take them to a lot of different areas. And these are also very common in these lower density areas. And then we also looked at express services, and a lot of you should be familiar with that. There are still some express services that operate today in the existing Duluth system. And so these are typically services that operate only during the peak period. So maybe during that AM time or the PM peak that we're looking at providing people, it's like 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. You'll have, more direct service that are getting people to the right destination. A good example of that might be like the 2X. So services that's taking people from West Duluth and kind of that further west region into downtown Duluth. And so, when we went through these route workshops, it was a creative exercise. And so, as I mentioned, we took all those service types we just went through, and we're really just exploring as many options as we can. And our goal was to come up with 2 different concepts. And so we actually came up with 2 concepts where they were both focused more on frequency, to provide a lot of frequent service to a lot of those major key destination areas. However, we have a variation of that, and we like to test out a lot of options. And so we had a frequency focused concept, as well as a frequency balance, where we scaled some things back and added some other options to it. And so throughout this process, we were creative. We explored options. We tested all those different scenarios out, our service types out. We looked at different areas. We're considering, how productive are those routes going to be? We looked at a service. A good example is like we looked at services connecting Superior to West Duluth and up to the Miller Hill Mall. Is it going to be productive? Is it not being productive? How does that route operate by itself versus how does it operate as a system? Is it really improving people's lives, in part of connecting them into other services, or is it really focused on a small group of people? And we kind of look at these trade-offs and evaluate them as we go through it to try to figure out, what's going on and what's going to be the best option out for everybody. And so in concept 1, we really focused on a high frequency service. So this is kind of that pre-BRT concept I was mentioned before. We were looking at connecting a lot of the key activity centers together and putting a lot of resources into that to have really high frequencies in between those areas. And what that does is we have we're basically trying to connect people into that system as much as possible. So then we had a lot of circulators and different things on the outside that were making people transfer into that system to really regionally travel. And then we look at concept 2, which is a little bit more scaled back, where we take that frequent service that we were looking at and we actually scale back that resources where we're able to free that up to do a lot of other things. So we explore, more circulation, more coverage service, more 1-seat rides, or do people not want to transfer? Can they actually just get on a bus and that will take them to their destination? We begin to explore all those things. Chris?
I was just going to mention something about frequency for those who might not be familiar with the term. It's kind of technical and hard to understand, especially if you don't regularly ride the bus and understand how important it is for buses to come by often. In one example I've been using for folks to explain it is that imagine your car is parked in the garage, but the garage door only opens up once an hour, and you've got to hit it just right. And if you don't get out in time, you can't leave your house. So that might be one way to think of frequency, is how often your garage door opens up for you.
Thank you, Chris. So I just want to highlight these really quickly. So these are kind of what we're looking at in terms of concepts. This isn't everything that we looked at, but for concept 1, these areas in the green, we're really focusing on some higher frequency service. We're connecting a lot of people into areas. We're testing out different alternatives in Superior. We're looking at different alternatives in West Duluth, up in the mall. We're trying to get a variety of these things put together. And then we also look at concept 2, which we're kind of reducing. There's no more green lines. We kind of have less of that. But we're also testing out some additional things here. Again, more 1-seat rides. Instead of transferring maybe at some of these areas we've identified, you might be able to have more direct service into maybe downtown Duluth or even to Superior and up into the mall. And so we're looking at these options. We're testing out a lot of these things. But ultimately, we looked at these and we did a detailed evaluation of both concepts. So we took these networks that we developed and we looked at coverage, we looked at trip quality, and we looked at equity. And we have a variety of metrics that we went into about that. We basically pull them together and try to figure out what are the best features of each of these concepts. How are they working? How are they changing? And could we take those and merge them together into the best draft network as possible? And so that is what we did, is we looked at both of those. We merged what we liked about each of them, and we created our draft recommended network. So we're running a little bit late here, but we're going to take a quick break. How about a 5-minute break here? And let's plan on being back about 11:14. And so it's about 5 minutes. And then we can jump into the next part and really introduce you to the network. So with that, everyone, let's please take a break, and then we will touch base here shortly. Give everybody about 1 more minute. We'll start in about a minute, everybody. Okay. Well, I hope everyone has made it back. So please, we're going to get started here as we get into this, and we'd like to discuss the recommended draft network that we've been working on. And so really, this is a couple things. This is what we're calling, it's the Better Bus Blueprint. It's the recommended draft network. We think it's a bold vision for the future. It's our new proposed system. There's quite a few changes that are out there. And so ultimately, we'll go through this process. We'll highlight some things. We'll talk about everything more at system level. We'll talk about our evaluation a little bit. And then really, we have some materials that we can show you here at the end that will kind of help us navigate, send out more information about individual routes, about where everything's going, descriptions of those. And so we'll talk about that all a little bit later. But our new recommended draft network is a system that's easier to navigate. It's more consistent across all days of the week. It improves travel times to a lot of the major areas in the region, and there's improved access as well. So one thing I want to start with is here's a map of the existing system, and this is of the existing system on weekdays. And so what you'll see is there's 33 routes that actually operate in here, and we're layering them on different frequencies. And so when you look at this, there is 15-minute frequencies in red, 30-minute frequencies in blue, and 60-minute frequencies in purple. What you're seeing in a lot of these is a lot of these don't all operate throughout the entire day, but we see that they kind of layer on top of each other here. And so we know that there are a lot of services overlapping. Some of them only operate during peak periods. We mentioned there was that inconsistent service span, and then a lot of these are reduced on the weekends. And then I want to present to you our proposed network. And so what this actually is it's reducing from 33 routes to 14. We're consolidating a lot of those different types of services into what we're calling our high frequency network or pre-BRT routes. And these are the ones that are highlighted here in red. And then we have frequent service between kind of West Duluth and Spirit Valley to DTC to UMD, and from DTC all the way up to Miller Hill Mall, including the Walmart area. These services have more consistent spans. So they're going to be basically operating, starting at the same times and ending at the same times in general. There's more reliable frequencies, especially going on if you're anywhere near these corridors or in these red lines. Those services are going to come more often where you may not even need a schedule to take the service. This will be very frequent service, as well as we have improved weekend service. And so some other things I want to highlight in here is just kind of a change in some of the system. We still have one-seat rides that are happening that are going from the farther west region into downtown. And so those will kind of come through the main corridor. We've looked at improving service to Superior with a 30-minute route that would operate through most of the day that will serve not only UWS, the downtown area, but also go down to the Walmart and Aldi in this area. And we've also looked at keeping frequency in some of the other areas and providing a lot of service to cover most of the other areas that we've covered in the past. And so I want to start with high frequency services pre-BRT. And for those who aren't familiar with bus rapid transit or BRT, it's really, I mentioned before, it's a higher quality bus service, and it's often compared to rail. We can implement this service gradually, even though there's a lot of components that often go into it. You can start improving frequencies and providing a higher level of service to customers almost immediately. And so what does BRT look like? I mean, typically you have faster trips. It's a better experience for you where you're going to be making less stops, you're traveling faster. You may not need a schedule when you're riding these systems or when you're near them. Typically there's branding associated with it where they have enhanced bus stops, wrapped buses, so a fancy designed bus, really easy to identify and use, as well as there's a lot of things that might happen on the roadway side where they're looking at maybe dedicated running way where a bus can actually run on its own lane and the road to really improve services, and it makes it a fast, frequent, and reliable trips. Chris?
Something I'd like to mention is I've been keeping close eye on ridership trends in the Twin Cities, and what they're seeing is that their bus rapid transit routes have been the most resilient throughout the pandemic, whereas some of their light rail and regular bus services are slower to come back. Their BRT routes have been holding steady and increasing ridership faster than the rest of their services. So kind of interesting to see how that has been working throughout the pandemic.
Absolutely. So as we go through this, I want to first start with the existing system. So we mentioned that a lot of services overlay on top of each other. Well, this is not exactly high frequent service. There's not necessarily time to come, at spaced out intervals. So it doesn't mean that they're coming 15 minutes apart all the time. Sometimes they're, right up behind each other, but there's also, a handful of routes that really operate on the same corridors that will produce a higher level of frequency. And so this is what we're looking at in terms of when we do some analysis, some calculations. This blue line is showing where you currently have some high frequency service in the system. And this is, again, consisting of a lot of overlapping services. So it's not that consistent, but it's about 4 buses per hour that are happening in this area or more. Then when we look at what we're proposing is we're looking at 2 different high frequency routes. We're adding a lot of additional areas that are covered, and we'll talk about that briefly here, but looking at kind of serving up the hill into Miller Hill Mall, Walmart, serving over to further sides east to UMD and throughout Central and East Hillside. And so when we put those things together, this is kind of a comparison where we can see this dashed blue line is what you guys currently have. And then the red line is what we're proposing. And really what this does is it adds 8 additional miles to this high frequency service. In these areas, you may not need to rely on schedules. And we're really starting to add in all that additional service where we think this is connecting a lot of places that people want to go, and we'll have very high quality service. And we'll talk about some of these benefits here as we kind of go through a few other things as well. And so I want to come back to this as we looked at the existing frequency chart. We talked about, the differences between weekday, Saturday, and Sunday, how some of the spans kind of changes on the ends here where services start and end at different times. And then I want to show you what the new network looks like. And so the new network has these much more defined times when they're running. Things are a lot more consistent than they were in the past. We've also looked at, starting and ending them the same times, having a lot of frequent service, not only on the weekdays, but also on Saturdays and Sundays, maintaining some level of higher frequency on those main corridors, but also kind of expanding some of the spans and here as well, where we just have consistent service operating on Saturdays and on Sundays. And so what does this really get you? We looked at simplifying these routes. So we know these routes, not only do they operate consistently, so they serve the same locations, whether it's a weekday, Saturday, or Sunday. It's always going to be the same route alignment. So where you're going to be able to travel through. We've done that and we've reduced those from 33 to 14. It's consistent again, 7 days a week. We looked at improving travel time. So we do know through our evaluation that we'll talk about here shortly that we're improving some travel times and connections throughout the region, not just on weekdays, but also for Saturdays and Sundays, and providing this enhanced access to a lot of these major destinations that we focused on. And so I want to talk about our evaluation, basically why we chose this network and what we're seeing in it, and why everyone should be excited about it. I think we're certainly excited to introduce this to you, but it kind of covers in 3 different things here. We looked at coverage, trip quality, and equity. And we'll get a little bit technical for a couple slides here, but I just kind of want to show you that we've done a lot of detailed data analysis. We looked at these things. We're trying to see, can we improve? Can we serve more people? Can we provide better transit service and better, higher quality transit service in the region? The first thing I want to show you guys is this map here. And so what this is showing is, we're seeing the existing system and we see a lot of circles out here that are all over the place. What we're showing is, where we're currently no longer serving. And so what we had to do in order to get from 33 routes to 14 is we're working within the same resources that we're putting everything together. We're trying to provide a better transit system. And some of the areas that we looked at to reduce service had directly to do with low ridership as well as low densities. We knowing there wasn't as many people in some of these areas, as well as they weren't really producing riders today. And one thing I want to highlight is there's a big difference between having quality service and having what we call lines on a map. And so when we talk about lines on the map, that's like in the existing system, you might have lines all over the place. That does not mean that those trips come very often. They might only come a couple times a day, and they may not be that usable. And there's a reason why some of these areas don't produce higher ridership in today. And so if you're willing to walk a little bit further, it might mean a couple more blocks for some examples here, but you walk a little bit further, you'll have access to this higher frequent network. You'll have access to a more consistent network that will able to get people throughout the system and really improve travel for a lot of people in the region. And so also when we look at some of these areas, when they have low ridership, And so a good example would be like Fond du Lac down here is if you're looking at this area, there wasn't a lot of ridership going on here and you're providing service out here. When you do that, you're spending a lot of money to provide service, but you're not getting a lot of returns. You're not seeing a lot of people take that service. And so that's a low productive route, what we're looking at. So trying to figure out where those areas were, could we consolidate things? Can we consolidate that into areas where a lot more riders will be and will take the service? And so one thing I want to highlight is we do know that when we do this, all these areas are no longer covered. From a coverage standpoint, we're reducing the population that it's directly serving. Now, this means when we look at a quarter mile, we reduced by about 15,000 people. And I highlighted some areas, specifically in Superior. We know that about half of that number is happening in Billings Park, in South Superior and East End. And primarily when we look at that, not a lot of riders were serving there. And we'll talk about that here on the next slide as well. But about 8,000 people were the people that cut out here. So on the Minnesota side, we are really providing a higher level of coverage, but there are some other areas that kind of play into that as well and kind of do that. And then if you look at this other metric in terms of going to 3/4 mile, so making sure people, if they're willing to walk a little bit further, we're covering most of the existing system, about 95%. And then comparing that to employment, so we're covering almost 100% of the system, 96 within a quarter mile and 99% within 3/4 mile of all of the existing system today. One thing I want to highlight is, I talked about productivity, I talked about ridership. And so on here, you'll see, a variety of dots in certain areas. And when we had to remove service or look at kind of scaling back service in some of these areas, we wanted to see how many riders we were still serving. And so the new system within a quarter mile of all these routes serves 98% of the existing ridership. And that equates to about not serving 225 daily boardings. And so those are spread out throughout the system. And you look at, a variety of areas, you'll see some in Billings Park, there'll be some over here in the East End, maybe down South Superior. We see up here in Denfeld, as well as Raleigh area, kind of Proctor. And so you can see a little dots all over the place here. These are very small numbers. And when we serve 98% of the system, like we're really focusing those resources to try to improve the transit area. And ultimately, we've been monitoring these with the help of DTA staff recently throughout the pandemic. And all of these areas today, as we're looking at, are producing very low numbers throughout the pandemic. So not only were they not producing back in 2019, when we looked at a lot of this data, where a lot of this data is from, but when we looked at throughout the pandemic, these areas are virtually have no ridership throughout the pandemic in a lot of these locations. So we're really excited about this and looking at when we add in the additional high frequency service, this pre-BRT as we're calling it, we're providing access to a high quality transit service to a lot more people and better access to jobs. And as you remember, when we talked about all the surveys and as well as talking to stakeholder group, this was a big thing for a lot of you. You wanted to have, increasing ridership, providing access to more people to major destinations, as well as access to jobs. And what we see here is that because of the additions of service through Central East Hillside up to UMD, as well as the additions up the hill into the Miller Hill Mall area and to the Walmart, we're really seeing substantial growth in terms of 16,000 more people can be served by this high frequency service, as well as 14,000 more people or 14,000 more jobs are accessible. And this is looking at some more historic numbers, not necessarily historic, but a couple years old in terms of data. And we do know there's a lot of development happening up in this area in terms of some low income housing, as well as some more denser developments that this network would ultimately serve, where we can see, improvements in these numbers even more. So as more development would happen on these areas, we can really have this high quality service that would be serving a ton more people in the region. And it'd be great to get them to travel between these areas very quickly. So we also looked at trip quality, and this is where it gets a little bit technical. As you remember, we really looked into evaluating travel times. And so one approach that we look at is evaluating that systematically. So we're trying to evaluate things from a system standpoint across the day, where I'm looking at, and here's a good example of the blue bars are existing and the green bars are recommended network. And we're looking at just an average travel time throughout the system. So I'll paint you to this graphic up here. We're really just looking at from all these points in the system, how is travel improving throughout the region? How are things changing? And when we look at this from a system standpoint, we're seeing significant improvements. It was 24% net improvement across, but we see improvements on weekdays, on Saturdays, and Sundays, where a decrease in the situation is a really good thing. We're seeing most people can make their trip much faster than they could on average than they could in the existing system from across the region. And I do want to highlight that 37% of trips improved significantly. So we looked at a big metric here in terms of how many trips were improving by 25% or more. and 37% of trips in the system improved by 25% or more, which is outstanding. We're really improving, how people can get to and from these areas. And a lot of that has to do with that high frequent network and the more consistent service spans that we have out there as well. And then on the reverse side, because we're making these changes and kind of doing these, there are going to be some people impacted, but there's a trade-off here in terms of balancing that out. And one thing we notice is that only about 1.5% of trips experience significant worsening of travel time. So basically an increase of 25% or more. And a lot of those are actually to the areas that we are no longer serving. So I mentioned areas like Billings Park or maybe Fond du Lac, some of those areas where service doesn't go anymore. And so all of a sudden, all of those are concentrated in that area. But the gains here in terms of 37% versus 1.5% is just outstanding in terms of the return on investment that you would get in really improving that regional travel. So I'm going to go through these next couple of slides pretty quickly, but we're looking at activity centers. So I'm going to go through, we have the 5 activity centers that we looked at, and this is for weekday travel. And I want to show a comparison of our travel times between these 2 charts. And so we showed these before, where the blue bars that we see here are places that on average can be met within 30 minutes, the orange are 30 to 60, and the black are 60. And what we have been seeing is just general improvement for access to all the activity centers from across the region. And so for downtown Duluth, there was a lot of service already happening there today. So we weren't expecting, quite a big shift in terms of having more people being able to access it quicker, but by having that high frequency system in there and some other connections, you're able to see a decrease in the average. So we're measuring this across in terms of all the access, but then you're seeing, really want to pay attention to adding more blues, more oranges, and having less of these black bars in here. So really starting to see access to a lot of these locations really improve and being able to get to locations much faster. And so we do this for each activity center. We looked at UMD. Again, we saw a reduction here, not quite as significant. Again, there's a lot of travel that currently goes, or a lot of service that currently goes to UMD, but we do see an improvement here. We're seeing, an increase in these oranges, and we're seeing a kind of the general decrease in travel time for a lot of these other areas. So although many places still might take on average over 60 minutes, and again, we have to talk about average. We're measuring this across the day, not a specific trip. But when you look at that, we're really reducing that. So we're improving that travel for a lot of people, even if it's longer than 60 minutes, that is consistently improving. Look at Miller Hill Mall, we can greatly see how we have more blues, more oranges. We dropped almost 20 minutes on the average here. So we're having a lot more access up to the hill, to the Miller Hill Mall area, really improving how, people get to those commercial areas, as well as the new developments going up there. That's going to be really valuable as well. Looked at West Duluth in general, we're looking at this huge part of these orange really growing. We're reducing by about 12 minutes on average here, but again, lowering a lot of these black bars, trying to add more of the blue and oranges, really providing access to a lot of these locations in less than 60 minutes. And then we're really excited about this one. So I mentioned that we have 30-minute service coming across the bridge into Superior from downtown. And when we look at some of these things and how we kind of set the new network, when we evaluated Superior, we really knew that a lot of locations were just, would take a long time. It might take many transfers to get to a lot of locations, especially on the Minnesota side. And so Superior was kind of isolated as an island. And when we make a connection by having a improved service make across that bridge and over into Superior, we're able to greatly reduce this. And this is outstanding. Our average dropped by about 45 minutes, which is almost unheard of in transit. And you can't really get something dropping that much and really improving it to access to a whole region. So this is something that not only were we improving that and improving more locations that could be met in 60 minutes, but look at how different these are, where a lot of these black bars have significantly dropped. We're not looking at 180-minute travel times. We're looking at things that can get less than 100, less than 80, just over 60 minutes on average. And so really reducing that, and I think what's really valuable about this is we're connecting, the Wisconsin side to the Minnesota side in a more effective manner here and able to improve those regional travel connections and patterns. So we talked about quality transit area, and we use this as a valuation metric. And so just to kind of recap what this is, we look at accessibility, we look at mobility and consistency. And so really what we're evaluating here is how often can areas be accessed within 60 minutes across a day on average. And so we did this for each of the activity centers, and we'll show some side-by-side routes here as well. And so again, just to kind of look at it systematically, our goal in this is to actually improve regional access. And so when we look at this, we measure what the access was with quality transit in the blue bars as existing and the green bars as our recommended network. And so when you look through these, we can see improvement here is great. So we're measuring area, we're seeing the size of these travel areas within 60 minutes grow that people can reliably make. And so we're looking at this kind of as a combined metric, but what it really tells us in the end is that riders can reliably access a lot more locations than they could in the past. And we'll look at some of those examples here. And so the first one is downtown Duluth. And so from downtown Duluth, this red dot is downtown Duluth, and all these other locations are just kind of the blue dots spread out. But what I want to focus on is these teal shades that we're seeing. And so this is that area of access that you can travel within 60 minutes and consistently within 60 minutes. And so, currently it's pretty good in downtown Duluth. And then you look over here and what do you see? You see a lot more service kind of going up the hill, getting areas up to Walmart that wasn't accessible before. You're seeing some things fill in down here, but the big one is you're seeing access to Superior. And so this can be consistently made within 60 minutes or less throughout the system to a lot of locations in Superior. And that's a huge gain as well. We looked at UMD. So looking at UMD, we do see better access up into Miller Hill Mall. I know that is a valuable connection to a lot of people as well. So being able to get up there, improve access to West Duluth, we're seeing improvement there as well. From Miller Hill Mall, we're kind of seeing, again, gradually making this bigger. You're seeing more consistent access the reverse way. So UMD is better access. We have even better connections happening down in the West Duluth area. And this is primarily major connections happening with the high frequency service make this possible. And we look at West Duluth. This is a little bit of a shift. We see some changing travel patterns here, but what we do see is from West Duluth, we do see better access up into UMD and up into Miller Hill Mall. Previously, there was some better access that were happening kind of further west. This service still is maintained to some extent. We have still routes that are going down here and serving, but in terms of our reliability metric, within 60 minutes, you can still get to Morgan Park and these areas from West Duluth, but these things tend to change a little bit. But generally, we do see improvements. This area is growing. It's just shifting a little bit. And then downtown Superior, again, very excited about downtown Superior and kind of being able to improve that access where we're looking at existing, where you're pretty much isolated into Superior versus what we're proposing is going to give people access into not only downtown, but Lincoln Park and a lot of employment access and job areas that are really valuable for them. So the final thing that we looked at is evaluating equity, and we're making sure we're serving the most vulnerable citizens. And so looking at this, I'm going to come back to this map in terms of areas that we aren't covering and talk about this a little bit. So, when we look at, taking service out of areas, we talked about we're reducing some populations in these areas. What I want to focus on is that, yes, there was a reduction in some of the population coverage. And so there was an expected reduction to maybe happen to these equity populations. And by equity populations, we identified them as a few things. We identified areas, BIPOC populations, so Black, Indigenous, people of color populations, households with one or less vehicles, so households that tend not to have access to vehicles or very limited access to vehicles, low income households, as well as persons with disabilities. So we're measuring all these things and looking at them. And so we do have some expected reduction, but what I would say is that reduction is a lot less than the overall population. So, we had about 86% in terms of covered for our recommended network for overall population. And we typically have higher metrics that we're seeing for a lot of our equity populations. And so the other thing to highlight with a lot of this is that, there might be a slightly longer walk time for some of these people in these areas. But again, it's that access to more quality, consistent service that's going to be very valuable to them. And we'll talk about some of those metrics here in the next couple of slides. And that really, when we look at these areas, there's not a lot of ridership going on, and not all areas are really relying on transit, even though these people might live in some of these locations. And I guess I want to reiterate that a lot of them are happening on the Superior side here, Billings Park, South Superior, East End. A lot of people live there, but they're not really taking transit today. And so when you look at that, a lot of these reductions are happening in these areas, as well as a little bit in Observation Hill. But when you look at this, they're not really relying on transit today. There's not riders there today. So is that going to be as large of an impact than it is in other situations? So that's something to keep in mind when we look at this, is that if there's not riding today, are they going to ride in the future? And those are some of the things. But from a little bit of a little longer walk, a lot of these will have better access to a higher quality transit service. So we're excited about this metric as well. We'll come back to the high frequency when we look at access to these equity populations. Not only were we, improving access to 16,000 people, but we consistently saw, improvements happening to these groups. So within this area of high frequency, we're adding 62% to the BIPOC population, 45%, households have limited access to vehicles, 50% to low income households, as well as increasing access to those persons with disabilities. So really this is, just this access within a quarter mile to a lot of these much improved qualities of service that are really going to help people navigate the system and travel the region much faster. And then this is a little bit technical, but we kind of just want to kind of look back, and we use that quality transit areas, those teal kind of blocks that we were looking at, to really focus on, are we improving access to these equity populations, to these major activity centers or destinations like downtown Duluth, UMD, Miller Hill Mall, West Duluth, and downtown Superior. And what we'll see, the first one is change over existing. So this area up here is looking at the improvement over the existing service, our existing quality transit areas. So how many more people are we impacting? Are we adding? And all of them are positive. So we just consistently have added, more growth, more access to a lot of people in the region, whether not just be total population and jobs, but to our equity populations. And then you look at the percentage changes, and we kind of highlighted a few that were the top 10. And what's really popping out is Superior really sees significant improvements. A lot more people can access those areas. A lot more people can access better jobs within 60 minutes. So that's significantly improving. But as well as I mentioned before, all of these are positive. We're improving access to a lot of these major locations that not only have a lot of places that people want to go to, but also are the main focus in terms of ridership. A lot of riders are taking to and from those locations today. So why choose the recommended draft network? Just as a recap. So we're kind of wrapping up here, but we want to talk about the benefits and kind of give a recap of everything that we looked at. So the benefits of the recommended draft network are really, looking at the simplified system. So making it a little bit less complex, more easy to understand, having this consistency, the consistent routes. So having them be the same, serving the same areas 7 days a week, as well as that span and frequency being a little bit more consistent so people can easily understand it and work through it. We introduced the 2 high frequency routes, or the pre-BRT routes, and we're really excited about those. I think that's going to improve access and travel for a lot of people. We add over 8 miles of those types of services, serving over 16,000 more people and 14,000 more jobs with that frequent service, as well as seeing at least increases of 40% or more to a lot of our equity populations to that frequent service as well. We want to mention that we covered 98% of the existing ridership system. So there's only about 225 boardings that weren't technically covered in the system. And again, a lot of those areas that were reducing service in today's world in the pandemic are not currently riding as well. And so we're kind of covering a lot of the areas where people ride today, at least within a quarter mile. As well as, we're making sure a lot of these locations are more reliably accessed and improving their travel time. So we're really seeing these more significant travel time improvements. People can travel to locations much faster than they could in the past, as well as having those access, especially to those key destinations and relying on those. And so we really want your feedback. And this is kind of the last slide. I'm going to walk through a couple things with you guys as well here. But really now we would like feedback from you, and we'd like you to share a lot of our materials with your networks to try to get feedback on this network. And so we gave you this systematic overview of everything. And really we have all these materials that we developed, and I'll show you a few of them here that are already up on the DTA website. They can be shared. And so we actually have a link to one of our survey applications, as well as a QR code that will work, but we'll have some handout materials and things that you guys can access on the website that will really provide a lot more information, not just on the system and what we covered today, but each individual route, describing the route description. So where each route goes, maps of each of those, being able to explore them on the map, as well as a survey that we like to see, what people like and don't like about these routes, and collecting that feedback to ultimately bring it together and come up with a refined network that we can, propose to be implemented here in the upcoming future. And so without further ado, I kind of we'll talk about one thing really quick. We'll talk about our timeline, and then I want to show you some of these materials really quickly, and then we can answer some questions. And so generally our next steps, we're going to be collecting feedback through a lot of these materials that we'll talk about here in a minute. But then we're going to take that feedback, we're going to finalize a network, and we're going to seek approval here in the fall. There'll be some education and some discussion about bus stops, identifying for the new system, as well as a lot of outreach, as well as we're going to get into late 2021 and early 2022. We'll be working on implementing the system and getting actually things ready for implementation. So there'll be a lot of outreach and marketing. We'll be talking to the community about these things. The DTA is going to be preparing to get the system operational and ready to go for an anticipated implementation in the summer of 2022. And so I want to jump to a couple quick things here. I'm going to have to reshare my screen. The first thing I want to show you is the website that we've developed. So I'm going to go here, the website. Oops. So the website that we developed here, I'm going to start at the beginning. So it's a website that's going to help educate people on the new system, as well as look at a variety of options and lead you to our survey. And so this is a very valuable tool. A lot of what we covered today will be discussed in part of this document, but it gives you a high-level overview of our study. People can scroll through this website. It gives some definitions of some of the things that we talked about, talks about BRT. We'll tell why we're doing the study. So a lot of background information for a lot of people who haven't really been involved in this point yet. Talking about where we are in the process, and really getting into the recommended draft network. Why are we picking it? What are the highlights of this network? So it'll give some valuable information for people to understand and scroll through. And then we can go through this process of, this is a nice, neat little tool here where we can actually look at the existing system and they can play with it and they can see, how that system's changing. So you can really get a direct comparison as we go to areas that aren't covered, that are currently covered. How is the service changing? Where is that consolidation happening? And so we encourage you to take a look at this and kind of learn more about that system in general. We offer some descriptions about each of those routes in the system. And so we have some highlights here. So we'll look at those frequency charts that we brought up. People can kind of learn about this a little bit more on these features right here. And then we have a slideshow that will really get into more detail. And so this is where people can dive in a little bit deeper. Each route is going to be discussed in the slide here. So you can see each route as they're made up, where they primarily operate, where they operate to, what is their frequency, and where they operate in terms of span on weekday, Saturday, and Sunday. You can click through these and these will kind of jump around a little bit, but you can see, we can look at different routes. And so you can really start to explore each individual route in more detail. And then we really want everybody's feedback. We want people to tell us what they think. And so in here, there's a great tool that we have that has a map that people can kind of scroll and they can zoom in on different routes. They can see different things. If they click on a route in here, it will pop up with an information box that will tell them a little bit about that route. So give them some more information, but really they can explore in a map feature where all these services are going, where they can anticipate it going, and how often they're running, and more. And so they can go in here, they can even change different maps in the background to help them identify where they live and work and those type of things, and kind of get into that more heavily. Then also there's the survey component. This is really what we guys want you to push with your networks and kind of getting as much feedback as possible is in here. After you review a lot of this content and view things, you can select any of the routes in the system as well as general comments. You can click on it. It will ask you if you like a route, if you dislike a route, and ask a very brief survey of people as well as a general comment box. So in here, you can click on one of these. It will tell you, some options they can pick from, as well as some more fill in the blanks. And we're just trying to get as much feedback on all of the routes in the system as we can to really see, what people think about them and how, how they might have different opinions on how they work. And so in here as well, the riders can really focus on certain routes. So we have filters down here as well that will help them really focus on where these routes run. And so they can click them and they'll just highlight specific routes as well. And so this works on desktops, it does it on mobiles. So they can look on their cell phone and do some of this. It's a little bit more challenging on the map on the cell phone, but it is a possibility and that's been tested out. And we're just really looking to get as much feedback on these as possible. The other thing that I want to show everybody is one more share, and then we can get into Q&A and kind of wrap up this part. So we have some other materials on the website, as well as not only route descriptions and talking about each route, but we have this handout that's going to be very valuable to talk about the network. So we look at kind of highlighting some of the things in this document in terms of the high level, here's the route structure, so we can share this with a lot of people, have these printouts for people to take a look at what it looks like, as well as on another page outlining descriptions of each of these routes, how often they operate, where they go, some highlights as well on the back, some of the benefits, and directing everybody to our website, as well as a QR code that's really going to direct you to that page I showed you with the website and the survey. So we can get as much information from everybody as possible. The other thing, which is a little bit of a similar item for us as well, is looking at another handout that people want more detail. We have a document that looks at each route, describes them in a little bit more detail, talks about the changes, what routes are changing, what routes it's kind of replacing. So we're doing a lot of consolidation where a lot of routes were overlapping and going in different areas. And so we mention which routes that they were taking. So if you're taking route 1, and you can look at this and it will tell you if this is replacing a part of route 1 and so forth. But it does highlight major changes, talks about when these services are operating, and provides a deeper dive into all of these services. And we go through each of the routes. And so with that, I guess, Chris, I can hand it back over to you and we can kind of open it up.
Thanks, Adam, and thanks again, everybody, for joining us. We'll do a Q&A here, but as people maybe are trickling off, I just want to thank everybody again for joining. And as Adam had said, and what you've seen here is, this might be the most significant change to the transit system in the Twin Ports, maybe in history. So and we've been operating here for over 100 years. So it's a pretty big deal. So we need you, and we need some champions, and we need you to share your thoughts, positive and negative. We need you to share this stuff with your large networks. And we have a new post up on Facebook and social media, so please share those as well. So thank you, and Adam, we can just jump right into the Q&A portion of this.
Sure, absolutely. I guess if anyone has questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask them. We're here to answer some questions.
Don't be shy.
Don't be shy, that's right. See, we have a couple chats in here too.
Hi there. This is Katie Kaz from Miller Hill Mall. How are you, Adam?
I'm doing great. How's it going, Katie?
Hi, Chris. It was a really nice presentation full of data. I'm happily on data overload because I kind of dig it. So thank you for that. And I just want you to know, I don't really have any questions per se, but I want you to know that I really appreciate all of the work that went into this. And the employees that take the bus here at the mall, I know they appreciate it, and they were thrilled to have given the opportunity to complete the survey that you sent around. So thank you for that. That was very impactful to the people that work at the mall. And also I wanted to thank you for your partnership and your stewardship, because I know that members from the DTA periodically come up and help pick up garbage and keep our entrance 8 area clean. And sometimes when there are that many people coming to the mall at that entrance, it can get a little messy. So so I wanted to recognize the folks that help us with that. And just thank you so much for everything you guys are doing to make those improvements and make it better for both us and the riders.
Thank you, Katie. We appreciate that, and thank you for your partnership. And as you know, the Miller Hill Mall is a significant destination for our riders, and we see a very significant number of people coming in and out of the mall itself in our system. So thank you.
Could you talk a little bit about the reasoning behind ending service to Fond du Lac?
Sure. So when we looked at some of these areas, when we're evaluating productivity of these routes and understanding ridership, Fond du Lac was an area that had very, very low ridership. There weren't a lot of people currently taking it today, nor were there in the pandemic throughout what we're seeing, as well as lower density. So it's not atypical in terms of density. We look for a lot of population and employment areas where people are living or working, and there wasn't a lot going on in that area that really would sustain substantial service. So that's basically why we look at those productivity measures and try to scale some of those things back.
Something that's really critical to transit success is the land use component of this. So we need a mix of different uses, so not just one dimensional of being just employment or only housing. You need kind of both of them to really make it work, and a lot of them in a small, relatively small area. So Fond du Lac is very far out there, so it puts on a lot of miles with very few riders currently today. And we've tried a few different things, and it just doesn't respond well. So it's very challenging to serve and very expensive, which then takes away resources from other areas. Good question, though. Thank you.
We have a couple hands raised. How about Pat Keenan?
Thanks, I appreciate that. I'm up at UMD, and as was noted a number of times, UMD is one of the 5 high activity centers. And so my question is in regards to next steps and timing of feedback, et cetera. And I noted that feedback will be accepted this summer, possibly into the fall. And so I'm curious about specifics on that feedback. I'd like to get a little bit more input from our student leaders on campus, the governance, et cetera. As many of you know, it's sometimes difficult to get a hold of students during the summer. It's a little bit more of a downtime for us on campus here. And I'd like the opportunity to obtain as much feedback for you guys as possible from our students. So if you could talk a little bit more about whether you have dates or just kind of general guidelines on your feedback timing before moving into next steps.
Thanks, Pat. Great question. So we're going to be looking for feedback through our website and the survey tool through all of July. And we know that the summer it's rough, and especially now coming out of the pandemic, people are going to be really busy and doing more. So we're going to have to work extra hard to get as much participation as possible, which is why, again, we're going to be relying on our stakeholders very much to get the word out there. But all of July, that website will be open and we'll be collecting survey results, and then we'll be taking those results and analyzing and summarizing those for our August board meeting. Our August board meeting is on the 25th, and that's where we'll be asking our board of directors to approve the vision of the plan that we've laid out here. We may have to make some changes based on feedback and things. So a few weeks before we'll make some tweaks, but in August, we're hoping the board will approve, and that will allow us to move forward into the scheduling component, placing bus stops, and doing further engagement as we head all the way into summer of next year. There's a significant amount of work that has to be done. So we're really encouraging people to get involved as early as possible. And all through July, we'll be holding public tabling events at various sites. And maybe UMD is one of those. If you have any dates in mind that would be particularly useful, it might be challenging to get people right now, but there's locations all over the Twin Ports where we'll be holding tabling events, and we plan to host a public meeting that we want the community to come in and see a presentation like this. So we hope to offer as much public engagement opportunities as possible.
So just to confirm, feedback is only being accepted through July, not after August 1st.
I think our official cutoff date we've planned for the website was August 2nd is when we'll close that survey. We'll be taking feedback all the way through until we launch, but the most impactful and important time to comment would be right now through the month of July, as we're able to, we're under contract with CTG Kinetics to help us out. So we're kind of on a timeline that we need to follow for different steps to make sure we can implement by then. But yes, the most impactful time would be in July to influence the design of the routing and scheduling components.
How about Shannon?
Yeah, I have some questions related to Stevie's question. A couple of things. You partly answered this, but maybe if you could flesh it out a little bit more for me, maybe perhaps in some of the other neighborhoods. If the number one surveyed thing that folks are looking for is increased ridership, doesn't it make sense to offer service to where you have more potential riders who aren't already riding? And I guess the question there is more about what was sort of the tipping point there, or how did the potentiality versus existing ridership balance out here?
Sure. And so I guess I can talk about, remember we showed that transit propensity map that we looked at and trying to identify areas that we're really focusing on where we think a lot more people are willing to ride. And when we look out kind of in the further out regions of Fond du Lac, it's a less dense area that didn't have necessarily a lot of population, and we weren't seeing a lot of significant existing travel that was happening out there. So there weren't a lot of riders taking that service today. We didn't think that the makeup in terms of land use as well as housing developments was dense enough to really support a major increase in service that would be out there, or having some type of route really serving those people. And so it's a balance when we look at all of these things. We have to look across the system, but there's a lot of other areas that have a lot more potential for higher ridership that probably have that as well. But then when we look at some of these locations, we're cutting service that typically have just low riders today and have been throughout the pandemic, as well as not seeing enough demand from a population standpoint to really support a really quality service.
Right,
And-
I'm understanding that, but I'm thinking about potential and existing or in process developments in Leicester Park and Morgan Park, and how much that was factoring in, understanding the non-density in Fond du Lac that may not currently or future be the case in some of these other areas.
Sure. Yeah, so when we look at those areas, I mean, we were acknowledging that there are some of these new developments coming online that might be in certain places, whether that's, in that region or up in Miller Hill Mall and some other locations. And so we're aware of that. And I guess one thing to keep in mind is as this system is to kind of evolve over time, there's a lot of opportunity to add frequency to a lot of these areas. So as those developments get built out, as more people live there, then that becomes more of a question about how to serve them, and maybe you're looking at an increase of frequency to those locations. And so I would say right now, currently, we didn't think there was enough demand there to really say that it would deserve a very high level frequent service. But in the future, with more development, it might be.
I'll add to that, one of our guiding principles was really to create an attractive service. And currently with the resources we have in a lot of these areas, we have hyper specialized service that it's more so just a line on a map, and we provide irregular trips out to some of these areas where it doesn't even have a baseline level of attractiveness, and other areas of the city don't either. So one of our goals of making it attractive is to increase the frequencies and make it more consistent in those areas of transit propensity.
Thank you.
Yeah, Lindsay?
Hi, Lindsay Jacobson. I'm with the Superior Business Improvement District, and we recently, renovated Tower Avenue and Belknap. And when we were going through Belknap, there was a lot of question from different businesses that would lose parking on Belknap because of different bus stops. Are any of those being eliminated on Belknap, or will all bus stops just always stay? Or maybe there's a list that you had shown, just because it would be nice to notify businesses if that's going to change.
I'm glad you brought up the bus stops, Lindsay. And so our next step after we establish the routes, so once our board of directors approves the vision, our next step is then to move into a bus stop project where we will identify new bus stop locations or proposed bus stop locations throughout the system. So as Belknap becomes a more important part of our system, we'll look through there, and we will look at the existing bus stops and see if some of them need to be eliminated or moved, or more of them, or whatever. So we'll be looking at that and then putting out a document highlighting all the proposed bus stop locations and which ones might be moved or eliminated. And the public and businesses, they'll all have the opportunity to comment on that before we establish new bus stop locations.
Do you know currently which bus stop locations are being utilized? One of which is in front of a law office. And his concern was that he had a lot of folks that had disability issues, mobility issues, and now they can't park right in front anymore. So I'm just curious if there's any information, or you and I can speak offline too and talk about some of the locations on Belknap, and are they all being used, or how much and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's exactly what we'll evaluate is usage, and there's a lot of things that go into evaluation of bus stop locations. And a lot of our riders also have some of those mobility issues. So that's one of the things we need to keep in mind when we think of our bus stop locations and how frequently we place them. So we do have robust data that tells us usage and things. And one of the issues in Superior is we're not providing the most attractive service we could at the time being. So although there might be low ridership in certain areas, that might be due to the lack of attractiveness of the current system as it stands. So, but we'll definitely get in touch with you, Lindsay, and make sure that you and your stakeholders are a part of that process.
And I would just want to acknowledge that none of
Thank
this
you.
is, no problem. I just want to acknowledge that none of this is final yet. We're looking for your feedback for a reason. And so this is all good. We would like to hear all of your comments. And please fill out those surveys and kind of get us as much information as we can from that. I think we have Stevie here. Oh, go ahead, Chris.
I'd like to first just jump in and recognize that we do have several of our Duluth Transit Authority board members on this call, and they've been invited to be listeners. So your feedback they are hearing, and we'll be bringing this along throughout the process of the board recognizes your comments. So just wanted to point that out so you know that we have a number of DTA staff and board members here listening to your feedback. So thank you.
Like we have Stevie again.
Yeah, I was just curious how you guys are planning to gather feedback from people who aren't online or who aren't, you know, looped into this kind of stuff.
Yep, that's a really good point. Chris, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, we're creating a bunch of paper sheets that'll have essentially the exact same questions that are on our online survey. So we'll have those at our downtown transit center, and we can send those out by request too. So if any of our stakeholders want to help us put those paper surveys out there, we're going to try to get as many people to respond online as possible, just because the data analysis of it is really time consuming with the paper versions. But we will be supplying those at our tabling events or transit center, and we'll be more than happy to send those out for people. In addition to some of our handouts on our route profiles and things. So we want to get as much information out there to everyone as possible.
Thanks.
Okay, well, we're a little after the 12 o'clock hour here. We can stay on a little bit longer if there's more questions though. So does anyone else have any questions?
I'd like to invite our DTA board, if any of them want to make a comment or questions, I'll feel free to jump in at this time too. And thanks everybody again for joining us, and we hope you like the plan, and feel free, please comment on everything. So thank you.
Somebody commented in the chat parking, but I don't know what that means.
Does anybody want to elaborate on the parking comment?
I see DTA board member Casey has his hands up. Mike?
Take it away.
Yeah. Shannon and Stevie, I appreciate your question. I do know that the Fond du Lac came back a few years ago, and I've met people out there that requested it, and they were quite happy with it. They actually were visiting their father, and it took them all day with the current routes, and they'd have to drive into Gary to do it. And so they're really appreciative of that, but the numbers are low. And although I'm saddened by that, it's difficult. I've been trying to get more frequency to the Morgan Park area, at least by stretching out the number 4. I'm really kind of disappointed, I'll say, to see yet 60 minutes out to Morgan Park and Gary. I have trouble with not knowing what criteria propensity means and latent. I have trouble with that because these areas are affordable housing. Actually, when people look for affordable housing, they tend to head west. And I really was hopeful that we could capture bus riders with the new 100 units going up. If we do it later, have we captured them, or are we told them you got to get a car in order to live out here? So I'm just troubled by that. Sprawl happened by annexing these communities in many years ago. Sprawl happened up to the mall area. So that's the destination area, up to the mall. If we didn't have the mall, we'd probably have a lot more frequency down along in my neighborhood. and out west. So one question I have is I was kind of looking forward to a possibility of a circulator between Morgan Park or Gary and what now is you're going to Spirit Valley. I was thinking it'd be the zoo, but you're cutting the frequency off even further east. I was hoping for a 30-minute at least, and I was wondering how close the propensity was to providing 30 minutes, a circulator or something to at least the Morgan Park area.
Sure. No, I can respond to that a little bit. And so when we're looking at that from propensity, and so it's not accounting your new development necessarily in that propensity metric. So that is really valuable information to know more about to begin with. But one thing that we were looking at was just general, again, the ridership that was actually happening west of I-35. So including the zoo and beyond, it was about 3% of your system ridership. There was a couple hundred riders in total. And so that's kind of the metric that's really driving us as the densities and things change west of I-35 to really kind of look at scaling back some of that. But there are opportunities potentially for, other options in that area as well. And so we kind of were exploring one thing when we talked about those two different concepts. We looked at exploring service from kind of that west region to the Spirit Valley and kind of ending it there and having people transfer to the high frequency service versus taking a service in from that far west area, so Gary and Morgan Park, and providing a one-seat ride directly to downtown. And so we're looking at these trade-offs, and what we ended up kind of going with based on some of our evaluation was that we thought it'd be better to don't have people transfer and to bring them down into downtown Duluth instead of having to transfer at Spirit Valley. And so there might be a potential option to look at frequency increases in that circulation kind of pattern that you're talking about, and maybe looking at 30-minute service, but then they would still have to transfer at Spirit Valley probably in that situation. And so there are some options that we explored, and that's why we would like your feedback on all of these things as well to kind of hear that and see if we need to maybe make some changes to some of those items.
And part of the formula of the transit propensity, but not all of it, but a big portion of it is housing numbers and density and employment. And the issues there might be out farther west is that while there are a high number of housing, there's not quite as much industry and in jobs that are out there. So it's a little one-dimensional. So although there is a little bit of new housing going out there, there's not much in terms of employment growth out there, which would really help tip the scales of the transit propensity. Pat, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I'll try to be quick here. Did I hear you mention, I think it was you who mentioned a few minutes ago that there'll be informational tables, et cetera, set up down at DTC. And so my thought is not all riders obviously go through that hub. And you mentioned that earlier, we talked about the 5 high activity centers, I believe you called them. Has there been thought, and is it possible to provide that same sort of resource tabling information at these 5 high activity center areas for those who aren't going through downtown or who don't stop in the center down there? And I'd be happy to talk with you offline later if it requires some kind of coordination, especially up on campus here. I'm thinking there's a lot of riders even during the summer who pass through our hub and don't make it into the downtown center. And so that whole population would be missed unless there's tabling going on in other areas.
That's a great idea. Yeah, we do have more events planned outside of our transit center, and there's a couple in Superior where we're going to be partnering with the city of Superior at a couple of their events. We hope to get into the Superior Library. UMD would be great, and yes, let's chat offline and figure out a best time to do that. The mall would be another good one, and elsewhere. And I think what we're going to try to do is be a little nimble in that. Based on weather and things, we might not get a positive result being inside of a building as much as we would being outside at some of these bus stops, sharing some of the information. So for some of those dates, I think we're going to be flexible in that, depending on weather and timing and things and resources, we'll be traveling around periodically to some of these areas in the hubs to hand out some information.
Thank you. Let me know if it would be helpful if we had advance notice. We can assist if possible. It would just be nice to know if and when you're up here, and if we can help facilitate that, I'd be more than happy to help out.
Will do. Thank you very much. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? I guess with that,
I have
Oh.
a ton, but I'll hold off for a while. Thank you.
okay, I guess if there are no more questions or comments, please again visit the website. I put that in the chat so you can go to duluthtransit.com and check out all of our materials. And again, thank you so much for participating and being a stakeholder in this. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a great holiday weekend.